All right, Porkfest, how we doing? Everyone doing good? It has been a wild week. We've had a state senator get assassinated in Minnesota. Do you see that? We had, riots in LA. We had, of course, all the Iran stuff. I'm reminded of the quote from Tom Woods. He said something like, no matter who you vote for, you get John McCain. You heard Tom say that? So now we got all this Iran stuff. I thought we'd use Iran as a little bit of a thought experiment as we get started. So for all the parents in the room, I want you to imagine your kids, if they're young, imagine them older, and imagine that we end up in World War III. And your children get drafted because it's so unpopular of a war, we get the draft reinstated, and your child or children are sent to the front lines in Iran halfway around the world. But imagine in this scenario that things are so rushed, so haphazard, that your children are not given any armor. They're not given a weapon. They're not trained on the knowledge of the enemy, where the enemy is, what the rules of engagement are. They're just sent into the Middle East to fend for themselves. You would be apoplectic. Like, it just sounds absurd to even entertain this idea. My contention, and what we're going to talk about today, is that this is precisely what parents do when it comes to the psychological battlefields that we're in. When we are in a mind war, and too few parents provide their children the armor and the weaponry and the knowledge of the enemy about how to survive the mind war and how to help others. So I want to unpack that a little bit with you today. We're going to start with a quote. We'll see if the, let's see, we might need Miranda in the back to help out. Okay, so this quote from Michael Novak is the basis of what we're going to talk about today. Between the omnipotent state and the naked individual looms the first line of resistance against totalitarianism, the economically and politically independent family protecting the space within which free and independent individuals may receive the necessary years of nurture. Okay? To me, that's a powerful quote. One of my criticisms of our movement is too frequently we focus on adults. Most organizations in the libertarian movement, the freedom movement more broadly, however you want to describe that, it's all about adult outreach. And we're not talking to kids. We're not talking to the rising generation. We're not talking to families. When the family is the intermediating institution to keep the state at bay. Now, what is the state? You guys all know this. I often speak to like homeschool crowds, and they think I'm talking about like the state of New Hampshire or the state of Texas. You all know what we mean by state. Let's Miranda, if you can go to the next slide, let's pull up the video. We're going to have Neo explain what it is. Or Morpheus, rather.
The Matrix is a system, Neo. That system is our enemy. But when you're inside, you look around, what do you see? Businessmen, teachers, lawyers, carpenters, the very minds of the people we are trying to save. But until we do, these people are still a part of that system, and that makes them our enemy. You have to understand, most of these people are not ready to be unplugged. And many of them are so inert, so hopelessly dependent on the system, that they will fight to protect it.
All right, you can go past it, Miranda.
Are you listening to me, Neo?
All right, so the state is a system. It's a system of people. It is not this abstraction. It's not this entity. It's not big government. I think of the scripture from Isaiah 3. It says, "And the people shall be oppressed, everyone by another, and everyone by his neighbor." To me, that is the state. I know of no better definition than the state, other than maybe what Frederick Bastiat said when he said that the state is that great fiction through which we live at the expense of everyone else. Right? It's such a powerful Bastiat quote. Now, as we get into it, I want to unpack the state in three groups. I think fundamentally, when we're talking about protecting our kids in the mind war, there's three primary subsets of the state that we're talking about. It's propagandists, it's politicians, and it's pundits. And then later, I want to talk about, in this mind war, what is our armor? What is our weaponry? Not only for ourselves, but then for our kids. So first, let's talk about propagandists. Miranda, go ahead and hit it. When we think about propaganda, we think about Goebbels, right? When I say propaganda, most of you, your minds go to World War II. Goebbels was the minister of public enlightenment and propaganda. in 1933, appointed to this position after Hitler rises to power. He wrote in his journal, so he was kind of a newspaper dude, he was a media guy, he had a way with words. And after he hears Hitler for the first time, he writes this in his journal. "It is impossible to reproduce what Hitler said. It must be experienced. He's a genius, the natural, creative instrument of a fate determined by God. I am deeply moved." And so with the Nazis, they produced like low-cost radios. They banned listening to radio stations, frequencies in other countries. They produced these low-cost radios so that they could directly communicate to the German people. But then, of course, they dominated film and music and journalism. One fellow Nazi leader said of Goebbels that 80 million people were deprived of independent thought through his actions. Now, the question I want to ask you, because this is like the easy, okay, yeah, propaganda, the Nazis, right? But where did Goebbels learn to do what he did? If Hitler says, "You're my guy, you got to create this propaganda system throughout Germany," how do you know how to do that? He was just a normal newspaper guy. How do you create this massive system to influence the masses? Miranda, let's go to the next one for the photo of our friend we're going to talk about. Let's go to the next slide. One more. Okay. Goebbels learned it from this guy. Anyone know? Edward Bernays, gold star for the gentleman in the back. Okay. Edward Bernays, we call him either the father of propaganda. He's also known as the father of public relations. He was, interestingly enough, an Austrian-born Jew. He's the double nephew of Sigmund Freud, both by birth and by marriage. So he's learning from Uncle Freud, how the mind works and our dreams and our thoughts and all this kind of stuff. And he ends up, Bernays, getting a job in the Committee for Public Information, the CPI. Now, the CPI was an agency created by the federal government when World War I broke out. It was literally the propaganda arm of the federal government created to sell the war. Bernays referred to his work with the CPI as psychological warfare. Miranda, let's go to the quote. Bernays says, "There was one basic lesson I learned in the CPI, that efforts comparable to those applied by the CPI to affect the attitudes of the enemy, of neutrals, and people of this country, could be applied with equal facility to peacetime pursuits." In other words, what could be done for a nation at war could be done for organizations and people in a nation at peace. So he writes a book called Crystallizing Public Opinion. And he documents some of the work that CPI was doing to shape the behavior of the public. One of the things that Bernays did in peacetime pursuits, this is why he's called the father of public relations as well, because he took these skills that he developed for the government, propaganda, and he started using it for private corporate actors. This is the same thing. They're functionally equivalent. They're synonyms. Right? And so one of the things he's most known for, like literally the reason that we drink orange juice for breakfast and like bacon and all these things, is because these industries have hired either Bernays himself or people who followed him. One of his more famous examples was from the cigarette companies at the time. The total addressable market for cigarettes was half the population because it was basically only men. It was very kind of socially frowned upon or not real. There wasn't an uptake of women smoking. So the cigarette companies, the industry association, hires Bernays to try and make cigarettes appealing to women. There was this big parade in New York City. He had these supermodel type gals dress up as Lady Liberty, crown on their head. They walked at the front of the procession looking all regal, and they held aloft in their fingers lit cigarettes that they called torches of freedom. And at the time, of course, you've got the suffrage fight and women's empowerment and voting rights. And so he was pairing the use of cigarettes for women with the uprise of women's power, women's rights, women's freedom. And this became the symbol, and women started smoking. So this is the type of stuff that Bernays was doing. Now, he writes in his book, Crystallizing Public Opinion, hey, here's how I'm doing this, and here's what's going on. And that book makes its way into the hands of Goebbels. It is that book that Goebbels reads, almost like a manual of how to do propaganda. Now, Bernays, when he finds out about this, is shocked. Keep in mind, he's an Austrian-born Jew, and now the Nazis are using stuff that he's pioneering, right, to propagandize a nation and attack Austrian-born Jews. But like any tool, like a gun, right, it can be used for good or for ill, and he clearly found that out. Now, Bernays called his work, he earlier called it psychological warfare. He also called it the engineering of consent. Any engineers in the room? All right, we got a handful. For those of you who aren't an engineer, you know what they are. If you want to build this structure, right, you need plans, you need support beams, you need pipes running this way. You're architecting a system so that it works. And you're tweaking that system to make sure that it functions appropriately, right? So the engineering of consent, think about what he means by that term, especially in the context of the Declaration of Independence, that governments derive their just powers from what? The consent of the governed. If people like Bernays can engineer that consent, what does that mean for our governance? Bernays called the engineering of consent the very essence of the democratic process, the freedom to persuade and suggest. He was couching what he was doing on behalf of government actors as just free speech and persuasion. Miranda, let's go to the next quote. Bernays said that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. This was from his book titled Propaganda. It's a very short book. You get it for like $10 on Amazon. Highly, highly recommend reading it. He lays bare, even more so than in Crystallizing Public Opinion, which is also worth reading, how propaganda works. And then, of course, when you realize that a century ago, before he had tools like this, he was as successful as he was, it makes you wonder what's going on today. Now, the CPI, they did all kinds of things, Bernays did. They created this program called 4 Minute Men. And in theaters across the country, people were watching films. And the film would get like a third of the way through the movie or halfway, and then they would have to change the reels, right? Because the film cartridges weren't that big enough to hold all that film. And that took about 4 minutes. So CPI said, let's create a program called 4 Minute Men. And we'll have them posted in theaters in cooperation with the theaters. And in those 4 minutes, while they're changing the reels, our guys will sell the war and try to get people to buy Liberty bonds. They had tens of thousands of these across the country. It was a very rudimentary way of doing propaganda. Our challenge in the mind war is that this stuff can get very sophisticated with very significant, dastardly results. The next video, not quite yet, Miranda, but in a second, I'm going to share about Naira. This comes from the early Gulf War. Iraq invades Kuwait. There's a big frenzy. There's a question of whether the United States is going to get involved. It's similar to what's going on right now with Iran and all this with Israel. There's this question of should the U.S. support Kuwait financially, with supplies, with soldiers, what do we do? And at the time, polling was very low, just like it is right now with Iran. People don't want war with Iran when you look at public opinion polls. It was similar with Kuwait. That then built up to a congressional hearing in which a 15-year-old girl appeared to share a horrific travesty that she had witnessed. Miranda.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators, took the incubators, and left the children to die on the cold floor. It was horrifying. I could not help but think of my nephew, who, if born premature, might have died that day as well.
All right. I feel like I'm getting old. I need subtitles on everything. Hopefully you guys heard that okay. She's a 15-year-old girl sharing that she had personally witnessed Iraqi soldiers come into a Kuwaiti hospital and take babies out of their preemie babies out of their incubators and toss them aside to die. It was horrific. And later, when it came time to vote in the Senate whether they should go to war, declare war against Saddam Hussein, the vote margin was 5 votes in the Senate. 7 senators publicly cited the testimony of this girl among the reasons why they had voted to go to war. It turns out that this girl was lying through her teeth. Her name is Naira. She was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States. She was coached by a PR firm that still exists today. And again, when I say PR, you all ought to think just propaganda from now on, because again, they're synonyms. The PR firm Hill and Knowlton was given $1 million contract by a group, a shell company called Citizens for a Free Kuwait. And the role of that organization, it was just a little prop-up company funded by the Kuwaiti government, specifically designed with one goal: to induce America into war on behalf of Kuwait. And so they used the ambassador's daughter, they coached her on how to do this. She goes up, completely lies through her teeth, persuades enough senators. You hear this? I mean, the media erupted with this story. It was bonkers. Like, this went viral for back in the day. And people are up in arms. We got to go fight. We got, total propaganda, total lie, total, if anything, false flag. All right, another example. Cuban Missile Crisis, right? We got Cuba on our doorstep. The Soviets are coming in. They're bringing a bunch of missiles and all kinds of stuff's going on. Let's watch, Miranda, a short clip from JFK talking about this.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
Okay, so that's the context, but like with Kuwait and Iraq, like now with Iran and Israel, at the time, Americans, based on public opinion polling, did not support invading Cuba. They did not want then, like they don't want now, to trigger World War III with a global nuclear superpower. And so there was a group here in the United States, some of you know this story, so don't tell your neighbor if you already know it. There was this fringe group of radicals, as I like to call them, that did want America to get involved. They wanted to agitate for war. They came up with this plan: what if we kill a bunch of Americans? We'll bomb some cities in Florida. We will shoot down rafts and boats of exiles fleeing Cuba in hopes of freedom and safety. Let's shoot down a plane as well coming from Cuba. Let's do all of this, but make it look like Cuba did it. We'll get some Cuban nationals or people dressed up or whatever, and so we'll blame it on Cuba, and that way we will get Americans so pissed off that Americans and Cubans are being killed by these Cuban nationals, they will demand that we go to war. The fringe group of radicals to which I'm referring got an audience with JFK to propose their plan, which he flatly rejected. Now, why would a group like that get an audience with the President of the United States to sell a false flag proposal? It's because this fringe group of radicals, as most of you may know, hopefully, if you've done your homework, this crowd should know, was the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States military. The top brass at the Department of Defense. In a memo, you can go read this online, it's been declassified, called Operation what? All right, you're my people. Right? I go to homeschool conferences and I get like one guy in the front row. I'm like, okay, we got homework to do, everyone. Okay, Operation Northwoods, right? Again, another example of propaganda, of consent engineering. The engineering of consent. That is the threat in the mind war, that our consent as a people is being engineered. Let's go to the quote, Miranda. I know of no better, at risk of doing reductio ad Hitlerum, we're going to share a Hitler quote again. He says, when an opponent declares, I will not come over to your side, I calmly say, your child belongs to us. What are you? You'll pass on. Your descendants, however, now stand in the new camp. In a short time, they will know nothing else but this new community. And you might say, okay, yeah, but that's the Nazis, right? And did you know, by the way, like one of the early laws they passed was to totally ban homeschooling, and that law continues to this day in Germany? You can get your children taken away from you if you try to homeschool in Germany. So there was clearly a threat to parental rights to capture the minds of the young. And, oh, hey, we're in the land of free, right? This is America. And yet the early architects of the American government school system believed in these ideas. They embraced the Prussian model of education. Horace Mann, for example, said in a very pithy summary of what Hitler said, Horace Mann said, men are like cast iron, children are like wax. It's very hard to change the minds of an adult. I think there's actually There's strategic wisdom there for what I said earlier for us trying to spread liberty. Men, adults, are like cast iron. It's very hard to change the minds of an adult. Guys, I have found no better way to change people's minds than to go through those adults to their kids, because then the barriers for the adults, they're, oh, I'm too busy, oh, I already know that, their barriers come down because now it's about empowering their kids, and then the adults are learning alongside them. But people like Horace Mann and Hitler, they targeted the children specifically to focus on their propaganda. Okay, we can go to the black slide next and stay there for a second. Thanks, Miranda. We talked about propaganda. Let's talk about politicians. Did you know that roughly 1% of the global population are psychopaths in a very clinical, only one, right? I know, you'd think, let's round up, it's 5%. These are people who repeatedly lie and deceive to manipulate others for personal gain. That's what we mean by psychopath, right? Now, lots of these people end up in prison, as you might imagine. 20% of the prison population are psychos, which, for obvious reasons. But there is another group of people that is far broader and far bigger than the 1%. And these are called, and I kid you not, almost psychopaths. That's the name that has been given to this group. The former lead director of the FBI's behavioral science unit, he called these people pillar of the community psychopaths. He says if you're trying to, for example, get into politics, being an almost psychopath can really be a positive thing. You can lie, cheat, steal to get what you want, right? This, to me, as someone who runs a think tank and works with politicians, this exemplifies the stereotypical politician. And there's so many examples. For lack of time, I'm only going to share one. Miranda, let's go to our friend W.
If you've retired, you don't have anything to worry about. It's the third time I've said that. I'll probably say it 3 more times. See, in my line of work, you got to keep repeating things over and over and over again for the truth to sink in, to kind of catapult the propaganda.
Okay, do you remember that scene in Star Wars where Padme is like, so this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause? That's what I think every time I see this, because people are like, he says he has to catapult the propaganda, ha 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 ha, And so many examples. I mean, his dad, right, read my lips, no new taxes, of course, then there's a tax increase. He campaigned on a humble foreign policy, then, of course, all his cronies and the Project for a New American Century and 9/11 and all the empire building. You had Obama, like Corey said in the last hour, saying, if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor, over and over and over again. And those who publish truths, right, think of Julian Assange and the like, they're punished. Those who defend it, like our friend Ron Paul, right? He says truth is treason in an empire of lies. And that's precisely because politicians are part of the enemy. They are part of the state. They do not want us to understand truth. It is why truth is now often deemed misinformation. Hannah Arendt is, she's called an expert in totalitarianism. I don't like using that word anymore. For me, COVID just destroyed the term expert. But she's a really smart person who's studied a lot about totalitarianism, how totalitarian regimes rise. Remember Michael Novak's quote at the very beginning, that between the state and the individual looms the family, the first line of defense. Interestingly, not the only line of defense against totalitarianism, but the first line of defense. So Hannah Arendt has studied totalitarianism, and she has this quote where she says, the ideal subject for those who wish to rule. And by subject, she's not talking about history, math. She's talking about an individual who is ruled, right? The ideal subject for those who wish to rule is people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction no longer exists. So that shows you why truth is branded so often as misinformation, why it is attacked, why truth tellers are attacked. Because it's difficult. Think of it. If you're a dictator for a day, are you going to remain in power and increase your power if the people you are governing are critically minded, historically literate, independent, acting individual, people not unlike this crowd assembled? Of course not, right? You are not easily governed, right? If you are a dictator for a day, you want the exact opposite of that. That is why they have fashioned a schooling system that is designed to produce the opposite of those things. Now, in 1953, at a podium like this, Alan Dulles stood up. He was the first civilian director of the CIA. This is in July 1953. And at this lecture he gave, he warned of a Soviet mind control program that was being launched in the USSR. He said that the aim of this program is to condition the mind so that it no longer reacts on a free will or rational basis, but responds to impulses implanted from the outside. If we are to counter this kind of warfare, we must understand the techniques the Soviet is adopting to control men's minds. The human mind is the most delicate of all instruments. It is so finely adjusted, so susceptible to the impact of outside influences that it is proving a malleable tool in the hands of sinister men. We in the West are somewhat handicapped in brain warfare. It's hard for us to realize that in the great area behind the Iron Curtain, a vast experiment is underway to change men's minds, working on them continuously from youth to old age. The crowd was shocked. Newspaper articles were written, speeches were given. How horrifying! The Soviets are doing all this brain warfare. How are we going to combat this? And yet, on behalf of the politicians he served, John Dulles was completely deceptive, because as the CIA director, he was then overseeing a program that dwarfed anything that the Soviets were doing to try to engage in mind control. Those of you who have done your homework, what's this one called? All right, gold stars for all of you. This is Project MKUltra. Miranda, let's watch a little clip.
The goal, learn how to control and even reprogram people's minds. The CIA believes LSD might hold the key. Over the next 10 years, the agency doses a cross-section of the American public. Everyone from unwitting housewives to soldiers to even criminals like gangster Whitey Bulger is tested.
You know, what the CIA really dreamed of was sort of like a drug you could give to someone, get them to commit all sorts of unspeakable acts, and they wake up the next day and they don't remember what they've done.
They were looking into brainwashing. They were looking into mind control. They were looking into how they could create what they called Manchurian candidates. They were trying to figure out if they could get people to go out and do things that they would ordinarily not do, like assassination.
So the only reason we actually know anything about this, like a subsequent CIA director ordered the destruction of all records pertaining to MKUltra. We know probably less than 1% of what they were doing, because stashed in a filing cabinet in another government building, this is where we have to appreciate government inefficiency, that is just randomly stored, was the report of the CIA Inspector General. Now, if you don't know your government roles, the Inspector General, the role of the Inspector General is to provide accountability and oversight. Let's make sure people's rights are being protected, the rules are being followed, we're being transparent, everything is kind of buttoned up. That is, in theory, the role of the Inspector General. In this report by the CIA's Inspector General that survived, from where we derive most of what we know about MKUltra, here is what it said. If we can go to the quote. Precautions must be taken not only to protect operations of MKUltra from exposure to enemy forces, but also to conceal these activities from the American public in general. The knowledge that the CIA is engaging in unethical and illicit activities would have serious repercussions in political and diplomatic circles and would be detrimental to the accomplishment of its mission. The exact opposite of what an Inspector General in theory should do. So, we've talked about propagandists. We know that the politicians are trying to deceive us in order to amass power. Let's now go to the pundits. You probably all heard, the smart people in the room, about Operation Mockingbird, another CIA program where they basically funded the media and they hired and paid off a bunch of journalists to steer media in the direction that they wanted. In Congress's report, when this was revealed, they said that the CIA currently maintains a network of several hundred foreign individuals around the world who provide intelligence for the CIA and at times attempt to influence opinion through the use of covert propaganda. And you might say, well, yeah, the CIA, like MKUltra and Mockingbird, like they got pretty wild in the 50s and the 60s. We had the Cold War. Like, we don't do anything like that today, right? I mean, today's CIA, we've got Tulsi Gabbard. She's the new director of national intelligence. Everything's fine, right? Land of the free. And yet Leon Panetta, who was the director of the CIA from 2009 to 2011, admitted that the CIA was influencing media outlets to change attitudes within the country. He said that the government did this by paying people to deliver a specific message. You've seen this. We've all seen this, that the media has turned from being a watchdog, right, where they side with the people and hold power to account and shine a spotlight. They've turned from being a watchdog to a lapdog, where now it's broadcasting press releases and shaming you as domestic terrorists and propagandists and disinformationists if you don't toe the line. This is what has happened to the pundits. I love this quote from Seymour Hersh about this. He says that we lie about everything. Lying has become the staple. By we, he means journalists writ large. Our problem in the mind war, for you as individuals and for us as parents, is that the human brain is conditioned to trust. We are conditioned naturally to believe. And so when asked by a pollster in an opinion poll, hey, do you trust the media? Do you trust journalism? Only 23% of individuals, Americans, report that they believe journalists act in the public's best interest. Only 7% said that they have a high level of trust and confidence in the media. And yet, despite telling that to a pollster when they call you on the phone or they text you to get your opinion, oh yeah, I'm skeptical of the media. I'm a libertarian. I know I'm a rational thinker. I don't trust the media. And we would all say stuff like that. And yet in the moment when we see a headline on X, when we see a YouTube video, when we see a whatever, we are conditioned as human beings to naturally trust what we see, especially if it's from an authoritative source. So the story to share here, to show how this works, some of you have heard about this. You remember the Nuremberg trials in the 40s. After the war ended, they put all these Nazi war criminals on trial. And do you remember what their collective defense was? Just following orders. I heard a couple of you say that. Right? Oh, just following orders, right? So that didn't work. Most of them are convicted, hanged, whatever. Well, it was like 15, 20 years later, the Mossad captured in Argentina a gentleman by the name of Adolf Eichmann. And he was one of the logistics directors for shuttling all the Jews to the concentration camps and so forth. So he was kind of a high-ranking Jew. They find him in Argentina. They secretly bring him back to Israel. TV is now a thing, right? You've got television stations in homes across the world. And so they put him on trial, but they televise it. And this is a big spectacle because Israel's like, we want the whole world to remember what happened. We don't want them to forget, right? So they do this big spectacle. And one of the people watching the trial was what was that? I think he was a Yale professor, Stanford, or one of these Ivy League things. He was a professor of psychology. His name's Stanley Milgram. And he watched Adolf Eichmann give the same response that all of the other Nazis had done. I was just following orders. And Milgram wondered, to what extent are people willing to go to violate their own conscience, to do something that they naturally understand to be wrong, simply because of the trust and the obedience that they are conditioned to give to an authority figure. So he, being a psychologist at a university, concocts an experiment. Miranda, if we can watch the video. As the suspense builds. Okay, here, we might get it. Okay, we can probably pause and I'll just explain it if it doesn't work. Let's just go to the next slide, black, to hang out there. So it's just a little clip talking about, some of you have heard this before. It was an experiment where I would sit down behind a desk with a bunch of switches that would progressively increase the electric shock administered to someone in the next room. And I was assigned to repeat a few words, and then the person in the other room would have to respond with one of those words. And if they were wrong, based on the answer I was given, I would shock them. And then the next question that they got wrong, I would increase the voltage. I would go to the next switch. And what the video showed was actual footage of this experiment where the guy, as he, you hear in the other room, he hits the switch and then he hears, ah! Right? And then like the guy, if I'm sitting there behind the box, I'm getting a little uncomfortable, like what's going on here? Like this person sounds in pain. And pretty soon as the voltage increases, this guy's screaming bloody murder. Let me out of here. I don't want to do this anymore. And so the guy sitting behind the machine turns to the person administering the experiment, guy in a white lab coat, no credentials that the person knows of, no nothing, just guy in a lab coat, that's literally it. And he says, no, it's important that the experiment continue. It is critical. The person has given their consent. You must continue. And so he goes through it, and he's more shocks and more screaming and worse screaming, but pretty soon, no more screaming. Now the person is presumed to be unconscious. So the guy sitting at the machine is like, can we send a doctor in there? Lab coat guy says, it's important to conclude this experiment. You must proceed. what this experiment has found, it's called the Milgram experiment, is that consistently around 2/3 of individuals will administer the final and presumably fatal dose of electricity to someone in the other room they've never met, they don't know, simply because they were commanded to do so by an authority figure, a presumed authority figure. This experiment, by the way, has been replicated across societies, cultures, genders, ages. This is part of the human condition. This is why we and our children in a mind war are so susceptible, because we are conditioned to trust. Okay, so we've talked about the state. We've talked about its subsets. We've got propagandists out there. We've got politicians who want us to believe lies so they gain power. We have pundits who are their ambassadors to share these deceptions and to push them onto us rather than to enlighten us with truth. What then, in the mind war, is our weaponry? What is our armor? How do we survive? How do we thrive, fight back, help others? I go back to the Matrix. I think of Neo. He wakes up, he gets red-pilled. He first has to unlearn what he thought he knew. To me, that's a very symbolic and instructive thing. So often, those of us who are graduates of the public fool system, like I was, you have to unlearn these things, right? Abraham Lincoln's goal was actually not to free the slaves. So-called terrorists don't hate us simply because we're free. Inflation is not a natural or even necessary phenomena. Dropping nuclear bombs on Japan was not actually necessary. Again and again, whatever it is, we have to unlearn the things that we have been told. Because in order to win the mind war, we must deprogram ourselves. We must understand things as they really are, not as we were told that they are to be. Let's go, Miranda, to the next image. Now, when we have unlearned deception, when we're really focused on the truth, we feel often a desire to stand up. You've all seen this photo. Most of you probably don't know the story. This gentleman's name is August Landmesser. And at age 21, he was seeking employment opportunities. It was, very hard to come by, so he ended up joining the Nazi Party and for a job. And 4 years later, he marries Irma Eckler, who was a Jew. He was expelled for doing so from the Nazi Party, and shortly thereafter, I think like 2 weeks, the Germans passed a law banning marriage between Jews and Germans. So they outlawed his marriage. His wife was carried away to a concentration camp, never to be heard from or seen again. This is a shipyard. Right over here on your left is a ship that's being christened or whatever it's called, and a high-ranking Nazi official stands up, and of course you see everyone doing the salute. And here's August right here. He's got his arms folded. What people often don't pay attention to, and I don't know how well you can see it, but you've got this older guy giving him the stink eye, looking down at him like, what's that guy doing, right? He's going to bring some attention on us and cause problems. You've got, where is it? You've got the guy right above him whispering or talking to this guy, presumably the same thing, right? They're getting a little nervous because they don't want the attention coming on them. Miranda, let's go to the next one. You've all seen, of course, our friend Tank Man, and this photo is very famous. We share photos like this on Facebook or whatever, on X, and we're like, oh yeah, we got to stand up for truth, we got to stand up for freedom. And we all like to think that we would be folding our arms, that we would do something like this. Now, what's interesting about this photo, if you go to the next one, Miranda, is that this is what Tank Man was standing up against. Here he is, tiny, no one ever shares this picture hardly. I don't know why. Here's Tank Man right down here. And what you usually see is this cropped photo right there. This is what the dude was standing up to. Very inspiring to me, very terrifying. And again, we're like, if only I had that opportunity, I would stand up and I would be Tank Man. Let's go to the next one. Some of you may remember a couple years ago, 13-year-old Jaden. Yeah, give it up for Jaden, right? For those of you who don't know the story, he had a Gadsden flag patch on his backpack. The teacher said that it was racist, ordered him to take it off. He goes to the principal's office where he's commanded to do the same thing. He refuses. He had been reading Tuttle Twins books for 4 years. This kid knew his stuff. Go Jaden, right? This is the vice principal who, by the way, after we brought this to attention, it went mega viral. She lost 15 pounds from all the stress, poor lady. And so Jaden sits down right here. This is the stroller, so mom is over here. She's secretly recording this whole interaction, and so then she shares the video with me. She's like, oh, Jaden wants to stand up for himself. You know, what do we do? And literally, I should have brought the photo. He gets kicked out of school. They're driving home. Jaden says to his mom, Mom, in the Tuttle Twins and the food truck fiasco, when they had a problem with the government, they got the media involved. Do you think we could get the media involved? What's that scripture, like a proverb, like train up a child in the way they shall go and they'll never depart from it or whatever? So mom, again, to her credit, detours, no longer going home. They go over to the local NBC affiliate station. She sent me this photo later. Jaden gets out the car. He goes up to the door. It's got like the security camera, doorbell stuff on it. He rings the doorbell, and the receptionist gal or security is like, yes, can I help you? He shares his story, and he says, can I talk to a reporter? Will someone come out and talk to me? And, you know, nobody did. And so that night is when the mom messaged me, shares the video. We post it in the morning. It goes mega viral. Now, if a 13-year-old kid can stand up for truth, I submit to you that we all can. And yet, we find ourselves so often sitting down rather than standing up in a mind war. Why? Think of the photo with August Landmesser. He's folding his arms, and everyone around him is getting nervous. When you stand up in a sit-down world, you get the arrows in your back. And that's not comfortable for a lot of people. It attracts attention. Let's go to the next slide, Miranda. Next one. Okay, so I want to talk briefly about Alexander Solzhenitsyn, because the story here is very relevant. He's forcibly exiled by the Soviets after he wrote the Gulag Archipelago, where he shined a spotlight into their penal system, where he had been imprisoned for being critical of Joseph Stalin. And so they expel him to the West because he's made such a name for himself that they can't just kill him, otherwise that will cause all kinds of diplomatic problems for them. So they expel him, and the night before he gets kicked out of the Soviet Union, he publishes a final message to his countrymen titled, Live Not by Lies. There's a fantastic book in past years written by this name, and a movie coming out with Angel Studios, or a documentary about it here shortly. But the title of his address was Live Not by Lies. It was a powerful call to action and a plea to stand up for truth. Here's just a portion of what he said. It is not every day and not on every shoulder that violence brings down its heavy hand. It demands of us only a submission to lies, a daily participation in deceit, and this suffices as our fealty. And therein we find, neglected by us, the simplest, the most accessible key to our liberation, a personal non-participation in lies. Even if all is covered by lies, even if all is under their rule, let us resist in the smallest way. Let their rule hold not through me. We are not called upon to step out onto the square and shout out the truth, to say out loud what we think. This is scary. We're not ready. But let us at least refuse to say what we do not think. I think that is powerful. Live not by lies. Do not embrace deception. Stand up for the truth. When I think of folks standing up for the truth, I think of, Miranda, if we can go to the next one, the White Rose Society. This is Sophie Scholl. Her dad was arrested for calling Hitler a divine scourge. She and her brother on the left were members of the Hitler Youth. They got very disillusioned. They leave Hitler Youth. They start a group that they call the White Rose Society when they're in college. They wrote a bunch of pamphlets talking about the treachery of Hitler. She's age 16 when she gets arrested by the Gestapo. Here is a brief quote from one of their pamphlets. Why is the German nation behaving so apathetically in the face of all these most abominable, most degrading crimes? Hardly anyone even gives them a second thought. The facts are accepted as just that and filed away. And one more time, the German nation slumbers on its indifferent and foolish sleep and gives these criminals courage and opportunity to rage on, which, of course, they do. Each individual wishes to be acquitted of his complicity. Everyone does so, then lies back down to sleep with a calm, clear conscience. But he may not acquit himself. Everyone is guilty, guilty, guilty. Next slide, Miranda. So they get hauled off to court. They get caught. They go to the kangaroo court where they're just convicting all the political prisoners of their alleged crimes. As the judges, so-called, are talking, They stand up. Sophie stands up. She says, somebody had to make a start. What we said and wrote are what many people are thinking. They just don't say it out loud. Now, I don't think things are as bad for us. I don't think we face threats like this. At most, it's cancel culture, right? It's peer pressure. It's being disowned by a family member. For us to stand up and speak out in the mind war, I believe one of the greatest tools that we have is one another. There is strength in numbers. Miranda, let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to share a little goofy... let's see if it'll load. Turn the volume way down. Down. Okay, yeah. Just a little bit of sound would be great. I tried to, because I want to talk through it. So we got this kid awkwardly dancing, right? And he's got someone who comes up and joins him. Everyone, the person filming this, as you might imagine, they're thinking like, this guy's really goofy. Now these two guys are goofy. You can turn it up just barely so we can hear the music. Okay, so they're having fun. A lot of time is going by. It's still awkward. This is in Portland, as you might imagine. It could be in Lancaster as well. I've seen some of you dancing out here. They look like libertarians, don't they? All right, we got a third guy. He's cautiously coming to join. Oh, we got a fourth and a fifth. 6, 7, a little more courage. Okay. We got a little nucleus forming, right? Now we got a few more people standing up. We got a guy running. He's got FOMO. Wait for me. Hang on, I gotta join. Now the cool kids are joining. All right, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so I share that because I think there's a lesson there. It is hard to stand up. It is hard to speak out. It's hard to be August Landmesser and have the arrows in our back. But it's critical that we do so, if nothing else, to give courage to others. I'm going to end with a final story. We're here celebrating, tasting the revolution. Well, there was one revolution that left a bitter taste in people's mouths, and it was the Hungarian Revolution. The Soviets in Hungary had left only the tiniest tanks, the less experienced soldiers, because Hungary wasn't really a threat. And some Hungarian teenagers and young adults started throwing Molotov cocktails one day. They got so frustrated, and the one person did it, led to a second person, led to 4 and 5 and 10 and 15, not unlike this. And pretty soon, a bunch of young people in Hungary had kicked out the Soviets. These young soldiers didn't know, are we allowed to shoot? Should we fight back? The tanks are blowing up because they're not the sturdy ones. And so pretty soon, the Hungarians are free. They take over the Seoul radio station. They start broadcasting messages of peace. They start talking about a provisional government. They start trying to organize amongst themselves and figure out, what do we do? We've kicked out the Soviets. Let's organize. Let's figure out how to fight for freedom. And then the empire struck back. And the Soviets sent back the bigger, stronger tanks. And they sent in way more troops that had more experience. And they crushed the Hungarian rebellion. And when they did so, thousands of families decided, our prospects are glim, we were hoping for our country, let's get out of Dodge. They crossed the bridge at Andau into Austria, where there's a bunch of journalists and others trying to document the experiences of all these families. One family, the Hadjock family, crossed the bridge with their 2 kids, 13-year-old Vera and her younger brother. And as the journalist was talking with the Hadjock family, 13-year-old Vera kept interjecting with her own answers to their questions, trying to understand, why are you doing this? Why did you make this decision? What was it like? What was going on? And 13-year-old Vera keeps interjecting, and she says, I was so fed up in the schools, they were feeding us with lies. They were helping us, they were trying to brainwash us. And the interviewers are actually really taken by 13-year-old Vera. Why? Because as they told Mrs. Hadjock, the mom, all the other kids that they tried talking to, or the kids in the families where they're talking to the adults, had sunken eyes, they're looking at the ground, they can't make eye contact, they aren't able to answer questions from the journalists. So they ask Mrs. Hadjock, why is it that your 13-year-old daughter is talking to us, number one, but talking in this way? Mrs. Hadjock's reply was that every night after the lights would go out, we would take our children down into the cellar, we would light a candle, we would read the Bible, and we would cleanse our children's minds of the filth that had been put in them that day. I submit to you, applause for Mrs. Hadjock. I submit to you that if we want to win the mind war, if we want to not only survive, but thrive, it is going to take the same level of intentionality from us, that we and our children are susceptible, our minds are naturally conditioned to trust. Propaganda is far more pervasive than it ever was before. It is going to require us to be intentional. We can survive the mind war, but for ourselves and our children, it is going to take daily acts of courage to do so. Thank you.